Let's start. Good morning, everyone. I am Sara Pantuliano. I'm one of the two acting executive directors here at ODI, and I'm really delighted to welcome you all to such an important debate today. It's a critical discussion on how we make sure that we can really take gender-responsive social protection to another level. ODI has been at the forefront of this agenda for more than 10 years. We've published a lot of really seminal work on this. We've also been convening debates, such as today. We have convened debates, in New York around the CSW 63, the Committee on the Status of Women, and this is when actually we have been able to get to some agreed conclusions on how to ensure that we can have, improved access to social protection programs for women and girls. But we need to now move to making sure that these agreements are turned into action, that they become tangible, that they become concrete. And that's very much the focus of today. We're opening with this, a public debate, but we'll move into a workshop, so that at the end of the day, we can really come out with a clear roadmap with some concrete steps, both for the short and the long term, or how we can really make sure that we can turn these commitments into something real. And this is all the more critical as jobs change in nature, as we see the impact of digitalization. We see how the gig economy is transforming work, and we need to really reflect on how the future of work, the way in which work is changing, what implications it's going to have, particularly for women, what this new phase is going to be, and how we can adjust quickly to that. There is clearly a very strong, vibrant debate on universal social protection, and a lot of support, I would say, at the global level for that, but less so domestically. And so it's also important today that we reflect and we think about how to navigate the politics that make some of the advancement towards these commitments more difficult. And so we're really delighted to have been able to gather together a varied audience, but also varied panel with colleagues bringing valuable insights from different sectors, different experience from the trade unions, the Domestic Workers Federation, of course, the World Bank and DFID. We've tried to bring employers at the table too, but struggled a bit more with that. But without further ado, let me hand over to Francesca Bastagli, who is the head of our Equity and Social Policy Program, who will chair today's debate. I'm looking forward to that. Thanks, Francesca.
Thank you, Sara. Thank you all of you in the room for joining us this morning, and those of you that are online. I know there's quite a number of you following us online. So why are we, ODI and the UK's Department for International Development, convening this event today and a workshop that is taking place later today? We really are at an important crossroads in some way. I mean, on the one hand, social protection is increasingly recognized as one of the primary instruments governments have at their disposal in moving ahead with the social sustainable development goals. The SDGs includes targets that are specific to social protection and specifically in relation to, of course, eradicating poverty, tackling inequality, and meeting gender equality objectives. And it's not just the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Of course, other recent processes emphasize the role of social protection, specifically in relation to meeting goals around gender equality and women's empowerment. So importantly, of course, this year's Commission on the Status of Women on the topic of social protection and links to public services and infrastructure. As part of that process, of course, reached clear agreements, agreed conclusions, and commitments moving forward. At the same time, despite these processes and increases in many countries in social protection schemes being adopted, the reality is that we are facing pushback, and social protection is under pressure in many countries worldwide, as a result of a number of both political and wider developments. And we're seeing, of course, pressures to cut spending on social protection, to make adjustments that, in fact, restrict social protection provision. So we really are, in some sense, facing a tension between, on the one hand, quite a historic opportunity to move ahead and make progress in strengthening social protection and making it more gender responsive on the one hand, while at the same time some strong pushbacks, including important cuts in social protection that disproportionately affect women and girls, and or that specifically target the services that benefit women and girls. So in this context, it's particularly important and timely that we meet today to discuss this issue. I think that failure to acknowledge these developments and to agree on an action plan moving forward means that we will miss an important opportunity. And I'm absolutely delighted today to welcome 4 distinguished speakers to help us sort of navigate some of the issues we are currently facing in this area. First of all, Anush Basanian, World Bank's Practice Manager in Social Protection, Rachel Glenister, Chief Economist at the Department for International Development, Chidi King, Director of the Equality Department of the International Trade Union Confederation, and Elizabeth Tang, General Secretary of the International Domestic Worker Federation. Now, what we're going to do is we are going to, first of all, listen to a message that Michelle Bachelet sent us, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. She couldn't, unfortunately, be with us today, but has a message for us. So we will listen to her remarks, first of all. And then I'll hand over to our 4 speakers who will initially provide a sort of short opening statement of 5 minutes or so each, before then taking questions from the audience, both in the room and online. So just a brief reminder also for those of you that are following us online to please submit your questions, because we will be looking through those as well. But first of all, if I can ask my colleagues to please move to the video message. Thank you.
I'm very sorry that I can't be at this meeting to benefit from your experience and expertise in the many interlinkages between better social protection and greater effective empowerment of women and girls. These are both very fundamental human rights issues, core to my mandate and close to my heart. Universal social protection measures are powerful levers to reduce poverty, promote inclusion, and establish society that are more equal. They are a key element to advance the Sustainable Development Goals. And their contributions are particularly clear in promoting equality for women and girls. I want to emphasize this point by decreasing the obstacles that weigh so heavily on the shoulders of women around the world. The work you do as experts in social protection policies help tremendously to advance women's human rights. Women bear a disproportionate burden of unpaid care work. They are more likely than men to be employed in the informal sector, in poorly paid and precarious jobs. This limits their access to social insurance benefits, such as unemployment insurance or pensions. Currently, an estimated 740 million women work in the informal economy in low-income countries. 92% of women are employed informally, compared with 87.5% of men. Even where women are relatively well covered, their retirement benefits tend to be lower than men. In the European Union, for example, women's pensions are on average 40% lower than men's are. So we need retirement benefits to take into account women's unequal burden of unpaid care work, including years spent raising children and caring for elderly parents, which may have prevented them from making equal contributions. Measures to advance universal health care also have powerful benefits for women in this context, alleviating the cost and perhaps some of the weight of the work they do in caring for others. Steps like this are valuable, but for maximum impact in ending generations of harmful and discriminatory practices, we need them to be joined up in comprehensive approaches which work in synergy across the spectrum of government action. Health insurance programs needs to include access to sexual and reproductive health services and information, so that women, girls, and LGBTI people are able to make autonomous choices about their bodies, their sexuality, and their lives. We need affordable childcare and paid parental leave to support equal access to work. We need education systems to confront and push back against harmful gender stereotypes. We need social security systems to include non-contributory schemes in order to support young people in their search for a decent job and help them unlock their full potential. And we need all these measures and more to be drawn up, implemented, and evaluated with the meaningful participation of women, girls, and LGBTI community from every kind of background. That is what empowerment means: genuine inclusion and co-design of equal and sustainable societies. And all this is feasible. ILO estimates that systems which include maternity benefits for all new mothers, allowances for all children, benefits for all persons with severe disabilities, and universal old age pensions cost an average of just 1.6% of GDP. Even the poorest countries can afford universal social protection systems. But it takes political will. Today, we are at a challenging moment in the history of women's rights movement. After decades of progress, strong headwinds are pushing women back. 25 years ago, the Beijing Declaration and Plan for Action outlined concrete actions to ensure increased and equal access to social security for women. So we need to live up to those commitments. We need to keep pushing to advance women's well-being, their dignity, their autonomy, and their rights. So thank you so much for the work you do to advance these goals, and great success in your activity.
Okay, excellent. Well, I think that's a very inspiring message, outlines a number of issues I'm sure we'll be touching upon with our speakers, but also is very inspiring indeed. So without further ado, can I ask the speakers, we'll start with Elizabeth, for your initially opening remarks around the role of social protection in promoting women's and girls' empowerment and some of the challenges but opportunities also that we face moving forward.
Okay. Thank you. My organization is relatively a young organization. We were formed 6 years ago, 2013. It's a global federation of domestic workers, and by now we have 71 affiliated organizations in 59 countries, representing more than 500,000 domestic workers. And since the beginning, for a long time, we have not thought very much about social protections, since they are basically denied to domestic workers. Many people still don't know, even their employer do not know that they are employing workers. So they have no idea that they are employers and have responsibility and roles as employers. So when they are asked to pay even the minimum wage to domestic workers, they are shocked. So this is a key challenge to begin with when we demand fight for social protection for domestic workers. That also explain that why in a lot of countries domestic workers basically do not have basic legal rights protections on their labor rights, on social protections such as minimum wage, maternity leave, sick leave allowance, and retirement benefit. And of course, added to this is the challenge faced by domestic workers if they are migrants. In many countries where domestic workers predominantly are migrants or ethnic minorities, people in general exclude them from the benefits which are accorded to their local citizens, just because they are migrants or they don't belong here. And all these also have compounded the result that a lot of domestic workers themselves also tend to think that they don't deserve this. Because everybody is telling that you are only a domestic worker, and you are not other workers. So you should not be asking this. But this is change. Since our formation in 2013, we have been struggling and campaigning very hard to tell people and let people know we are domestic workers just like any other workers. So if there is maternity benefits for a teacher, there should be maternity leave for domestic workers. And thanks to the adoption of the convention, the International Convention 189 on decent work for domestic workers, that we have used as our tool when we campaign and when we talk to government, when we talk to our employers, everyone that we are workers and should be accorded the same social protection labor rights as any other workers. And we have achieved quite a lot of progress. Until now, there are 29 countries in the world which have ratified the Convention 189, the last one being Sweden. So that is an encouraging sign, and more governments are also considering it. And in 2016, we together with the ITUC has surveyed the countries in the world, and we found that since the adoption of the convention, about 50 have also enacted some legislation or policy or regulations to improve the labor rights, minimum wage, holidays, rest days for domestic workers. And in the last few years, we have also seen more and more positive steps being taken by governments, even in those countries which have never given domestic workers any rights and make organizing, association impossible, such as in Qatar. In 2017, just 2 years ago, domestic workers law was adopted, and in the around the same year, it also happened in Kuwait, in Bahrain. So even these Middle East countries, which traditionally don't treat domestic workers as human beings, have started to change. And at this time, Malaysia and Macau are also doing consultation on the possibility of making a domestic workers law, because until now there is nothing there for domestic workers. So there are positive signs, and on social protections, we see that this is very important for domestic workers, because even though we are not recognized in many places, but we are many. We are 67 million in the world, at least, and we comprise 4% of labor force in the world. So this is very significant, especially for women in our part of the world, Asia, Africa, Latin America, and Caribbean, and some of our members have developed very creative approaches to get social protections from the government. To start with, I think as long as 4 or 5 years ago, our affiliate, the Self-Employment Association in India, have decided to approach to the state level governments and enable the welfare boards, which exist in some states, to extend the coverage to include domestic workers, so that they get some sickness benefits and also school fees benefits, allowance for the kids. And in Argentina, our affiliates, which is called OPA, has cooperated with the government to register social security scheme, also including the migrants. And without the trade unions of domestic workers, it will be very hard for government and other body to reach out to them. And just last month in South Africa, the health and safety law is extended to cover domestic workers after many years of struggles by our affiliates, the South African Allied Services Domestic Workers Union there. And currently, one very exciting progress is being witnessed in Mexico. Just on March 30th, the Mexican Institute of Social Security has cooperated with the Domestic Workers Union in Mexico to implement an 18-month pilot project to register domestic workers into the Social Security system. Even though this system has existed for many, many years, but it is voluntary when come to informal workers. And the result was very, very few informal workers. For the reason I think Francesca has talked about, have not registered. Yeah, but now the government has decided to launch this pilot project to involve the trade unions in the implementation. And I heard yesterday that since April 1st, already 10,000 domestic workers have registered into the system. So we have 18 months to run to show and prove to the government that with proper awareness raising and also proper activities, it is possible to enroll domestic workers. We are willing to be covered and to enjoy this benefit. There are successes, even though there are not many, but what we want to show and tell the government that it is possible and it is important to include everyone, that no one should be left behind. And it will not happen automatically, but with political will and also appropriate approaches.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thanks very much for speaking and sharing with us the case of a very specific sector that is a large and important one, particularly relevant and important to, of course, to women and women workers. And I'm sure we'll come back to some of the examples you've talked to us about. Anush, can I ask you to deliver your statement?
Okay. I'm from the World Bank, so obviously what you're going to hear is the World Bank's what we do about inequalities. And coming from the World Bank, you wouldn't be surprised that I started the reducing gender inequality and this persisting gap between men and women is critical, first of all, for economic growth. And that's one aspect that we need to also look at how the social protection contributes to it. And in 2018, we studied in 141 countries. We looked at the high cost of gender inequality in earnings, for example. And there is an estimate that the loss of global wealth due to the inequality in earning is about 160 trillion globally. That's an enormous amount that actually equally all members of society could have benefited if we have done something about it. More recently in CSW, whoever was there, we actually launched a report. The World Bank launched a report that was about women, business, and law. I guess many of you may have seen it, which also found that despite all the progress that we have made in the world in the past decade, women are still only accorded 75% of legal rights of that of men, and many of these issues also linked to domestic workers, informal workers, etc., etc. But female people, 75% gap is quite large. Then we also looked at more recently at the female businesses and female businesses in Africa in particular. And there, again, the gap is enormous. And the report, it was published more recently, revealed that the women entrepreneurs generally operate in low productivity sectors, but also have a lower starting point, both in terms of human and financial capital, face legal discrimination, and because they have much larger, disproportionately larger household responsibilities, that affects their strategic and business decision making. So there are all these underlying factors. When we thought about it and we thought about World Bank's gender equality strategy, this evidence has informed us, and we're focusing on specific areas where we think in these 4 areas, if we make progress, that will actually move the needle on the gender inequality. First is about human capital and human endowment. And as you know, we recently have launched this human capital project where focus is on specifically on improving human capital. And second area where our strategy is focusing is to actually remove constraints to more and better jobs, and that is female labor force participation, but also occupational segregation and safety at work, and many other aspects that also we spoke about. A third area is also removing the barriers to the ownership of the assets, be that the productive assets, land, or access to finance, which is extremely important in our view. And finally, the fourth pillar is about enhancing women's voice and agency, and engaging men, and starting with boys, because this is the area where we need to involve them to be able to make any change in social norms and other gender aspects like gender roles and violence. So these are very important global strategy for pillars, and each of the sectors are developing, are in the process of developing. And social protection, we just finished developing our own specific strategy on how we're going to go about these 4 pillars. And in social protection, we can contribute to all of these, but I would mention a few. First of all, the overall system has to be coherent. The programs and policies and programs have to work together as a one system and cover all these underlying risks and vulnerabilities, and specific to the country. Obviously, you have to look at that particular country and what are specific vulnerabilities in that country, and what are the legal and other issues in this country. But then, looking at the social assistance, for example, looking at elements of the productive inclusion that address the barriers to productive employment of the female members of the household, and also focus on developing of this human capital are important aspects that the social assistant can actually target specifically. Social insurance can also be very specific in how to address the women disadvantages, be that informality, how to actually include informal workers in the current schemes, or develop new schemes for them. How do you account for labor market interruption when they go on maternity? But also longer life expectancy for female participants in the schemes. Another aspect that is very specific to social insurance is survivor pensions, for example, which are critical for preventing elderly female poverty. So on the labor market policies, I think it's very important not only look at the occupational segregation and female entrepreneurship, etc., but some of the aspects that may be outside of social protection, for example, the safety. It may be a transport sector which needs to be looked at to actually have safe transportation or cost of transportation, but also from the social protection perspective, look at the affordable child care and at aged care, because as we know, the disproportionately female members of the household tend to actually take care of older members of the household. So this is very important. And finally, there are several aspects that social protection, and we're very actively looking at it and trying to design our project in a way that actually address this issue, is the implementation. You can have the most beautiful policies and programs, but if they're poorly implemented, it's really important. They actually may hamper overall development. So looking at, for example, the identification, because many of the female members of the household are those undocumented. They don't have identity cards. They actually cannot even go register. Even if you have the most beautiful social protection system and program in the country, if they don't have that identification, they're not going to have access to it. So starting from the basics is extremely important. Or also access to payment and bank accounts. So if you actually make social protection payments digitized and you actually have, I don't know, automatically open a bank account for the recipient of a social protection benefit, it actually already would be able to cover a lot of women if you have a specific target, a specifically targeted program. So who then have access to finance, through that. So I think these are very important things, and so we actually now look at every single project in the World Bank that goes to the board from the gender lens, looking at whether it's the gender responsive and even gender tagged, which means that you have to make specific analysis for this country. What are the barriers to all what I have just described, and how your project is addressing. So I'm glad to report that in the social protection portfolio, we have 93% of all our operation last year were gender informed, and about 60% are now gender responsive and are tagged as the gender responsive project. So, and we're very happy to do it with partnerships with DFID and now also Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and Australia joining specific trust fund that actually supports looking at the social protection programs and policies that are gender responsive. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Anush, for outlining the World Bank's processes and focus areas of focus on this theme. Rachel, I'll hand over to you.
Great, thanks. So I'm not going to talk about DFID too much now, partly because in convening this, we want to raise questions and get ideas, and so talking about what we've done maybe is I'm going to focus more on kind of generating maybe some new thoughts and try and get you thinking a bit. As I was preparing for this, I was thinking, what do I know about gender and social protection? And initially I thought I didn't have too much to say. And then over the weekend, it sort of a various number of things started coming together into, I think, a coherent question. And it all goes back to when I was a teenager, I read a book which had a very powerful impact on me, called Small Expectations. I don't know, by Leah Cohen. And I really recommend you read it. It made the very powerful argument that the feminist movement had focused a lot on young women, girls, young women, and women trying to work while having kids, and that end of the age spectrum. And we had completely lost sight of older women. Mm-hmm. And that actually it was older women who faced so much more disadvantage. And I think, unfortunately, that while that book was written a long time ago, that is still the case now. And she was writing about Canada and the fact, the horrible scandals in old age homes, and arguing that the fact that long-term care is an issue that is that is, doesn't get enough attention, that you get such horrible scandals in the long-term care industry, it was not a coincidence that most of the women in that system, most of the people in that system were women. And so drawing a very explicit feminist viewpoint on that neglect. And then if I turn to development, I was shocked many years ago reading a paper about witch killings in Tanzania. And you think, well, what's the connection between Canadian old age care and witch killings in Tanzania? And actually, it's exactly the same issue. So, this is a shocking paper, but I think very rigorously grounded, which shows that in times of extreme weather events, you see an increase in witch killings. And of course, witches over the history have been single, vulnerable, elderly women, right? Exactly the women who are in those care homes in Canada. And you see a doubling of witch killings when there is extreme weather. And you can even trace back, people have now done it. I mean, you think that that's shocking in this far-off land in Tanzania. Well, it was not that long ago that was happening in Europe too, and the US. The Salem witch trials happened in years of extreme weather. Because older women are the expendable part of society when there is not enough food to go around. You see how this is linking to social protection. Social protection for older women is literally a lifeline. So now when I think of what we work on in social protection, I think it's really, a lot of conditional cash transfers about young women who are having kids and getting them in school, and all of that is very important. But I worry that we have neglected this really vulnerable part of the population. And I think that's an explicit, the elder perspective, and you talked a bit about it, is explicitly a gender issue in a way that I don't think we always think about. The third piece of evidence that linked in my mind on this is a very interesting paper coming out of Indonesia, which looked at a social protection system as sort of traditionally organised, that assessed people's levels of poverty using data and targeting social protection in that way. And then an alternative approach, which was to ask communities who they thought was vulnerable and in need of social protection locally. And the really interesting finding between the two, the one group that the communities highlighted that the data didn't, was elderly, widowed women. And I think one way of understanding that is that those communities understood that there was a version of neglect and vulnerability that was in addition to and was not always being captured by simply looking at assets. So in our, I'm a very data-driven person. If anyone knows my background, I'm an economist. But I also think that in doing that, we have to recognize that there may be vulnerabilities of that particular group of people that we are not always picking up. And we need to make sure that we're setting up our systems in a way that explicitly takes that group into account, because they are literally the people who there is no one to speak up for. In Tanzania, if you had a son in the community, you were less likely to die in a witch killing. But those without sons in the community literally had no one to speak up with and literally got killed when food was scarce. So, wanted to throw that out there as a thought-provoking thing to maybe we can discuss about what kind of the implications of it are. But, as I thought about this topic, this was the group that I feel that we need to pay particular attention to and think of it as age as a feminist issue.
Right. Thank you, Rachel, for flagging in particular this one area of neglect in particular, for sure, which I'm sure resonates with a lot of people in the room. Chidi, I hand over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Francesca, and good morning, everybody. The advantage of being the final speaker on a panel is always that you can, sort of rely on the fact that most of what you might have said may already have been covered, and new thoughts may have come into your head, picking up on what some of the previous speakers have said. So forgive me if there's a bit of repetition in what I say now. I should start probably by explaining a little bit of who we are in the International Trade Union Confederation. So we are the global organization of trade union bodies all around the world. We have members in over 300 countries, and we bring together about 180 million workers, which is still in a drop in the ocean if you think about the world's working population. But it's growing. Contrary to popular perception at the moment, trade union membership is actually rising in many parts of the world, fueled to a large degree by membership of women, it has to be said. We bring together around 70 million women workers, both working in the formal and the informal economies. And I think it's important to give a little bit of that background. I think it's also important to stress that we are part of labour market institutions and very heavily regulated in law. So we have legal obligations as trade unions. We have to have in place democratic structures through which our members can have a voice, can operate. And through those structures, we also engage in direct bargaining with employers, very important, as I'll explain further when it comes to the issue of social protection. Particularly, but not only employer-provided parts of social protection schemes. But we also engage often with employers who are known as the other half of the social partnership, if you like, in policy dialogue with governments. So again, also extremely important when we're talking about social protection systems and the role of workers and their organizations in relation to social protection, and particularly putting a gender focus, if you like, on the issue of social protection. I was really pleased to hear just the challenge, if you like, to us all to look at the issue not just through a gender lens, as we're often fond of saying, but recognizing the fact that women are not this unique, one-sided, one-dimensional apparition, that we come in many different forms, many different backgrounds. Of course, age being certainly something that needs to be taken into account when we're talking about building gender-responsive social protection systems, but also issues such as racialization of peoples, how we treat minority ethnic communities in the design of these systems, and other risks, in fact, because this is what these are. These are risks that arise from structural issues in our labour markets, in our design of social protection systems, which result in discrimination and exclusion. And if we don't actually take this, what practitioners generally call intersectional issues, into account, when we're thinking about building more gender-responsive, inclusive systems, then we're doomed to failure, in a sense. So from the trade union perspective, what do we see now as some of the key challenges that need to be addressed if we're really going to gender, if you like, our social protection systems and recognize their intrinsic value as a driver of gender equality and women's perception? I think one of the challenges has already been mentioned, both by the High Commissioner, but certainly by other panelists, which is the fact that we're moving increasingly to individualization of social protection. And for trade unions, of course, being collective-based organizations, this is of huge concern. When you individualize social protections, and of course we're seeing domestic workers increasingly feeling the gaps in terms of the deficits in collective social protection systems, then the cracks widen, and the cracks widen especially for those groups who tend to be already disenfranchised, who already tend to be around the margins, who already tend to be experiencing exclusion. And again, the domestic workers situation puts that very starkly because, as I say, they're increasingly feeling the gaps in deficits in collective systems, but the domestic workers themselves are experiencing great difficulty in accessing social protection. So they fill the gaps, and yet they themselves cannot access occupational health and injury compensation, they cannot access unemployment insurance, very often cannot access maternity protection systems. So you can't have one without the other. If you're going to have decent conditions for the largely female workforce providing domestic or in the home social protection, if I can put it that way, then you have to have the backup with a collective system, with robust collective systems that take into account everyone. When we're talking about gender components or gender dimensions of social protection systems, I wouldn't talk so much about the issues related to women's reproductive roles, because those are, I think, increasingly well understood. The issue around unpaid care, the issue around even what we've seen here, austerity measures, cutting back on, access to care services, access to healthcare, etc. I want to look at things around, for example, occupational health and safety, which I think, again, a couple of speakers have already talked about. Very often, these systems are designed, and that's a key part of social protection for women, but again, without taking that gender dimension into account. Risks such as gender-based violence, for example, that many women experience in the workforce, and often ends up excluding them from the workforce for significant periods of times. Sometimes is not taken into account in the design of either employer-provided systems or the more state-based systems, if you like. Issues such as protective equipment specifically designed to women, risks that are different for women in relation to cancer and other such occupational diseases are often not taken into account. And these are important not just in terms of ensuring that the risk is cushioned for women workers, but of course in terms of prevention, because if you're more alive to the cost of these issues socially and financially, then the likelihood of taking better protection and prevention measures increases. I know I'm probably at the end or coming to the end of my time, so perhaps I can wrap up again by a plea that when we're talking about social protection systems, that the design really has to be looking at the collective base of social protection. It is a public good. It's relevant to all of us. We're at a time when the world seems to be shifting quite dramatically under our feet. The world of work, of course, is no exception to that. It's changing dramatically. The fact that work is becoming more precarious, the fact that very often these days it's hard to identify an employer who would be responsible for helping in the employer-provided, or responsible full stop, for providing contributions to social protection schemes, means that we're in fact sitting on something of a time bomb, with huge numbers of workers who will have no access to social protection, at least collectively. They will have to find their own individual types of social protection, and we've already heard about the difficulties and the increased risks involved in that. So I think on that I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Chidi. And if I may, I'll come back to you straight away with a related question that then others can pick up on as well, and that is to do with the type of social protection, and partly it's linked to its financing as well. So if we, in part, some of the barriers to extending social protection to women, and particularly certain groups of workers, have been tackled through the extension of tax finance, so non-contributory social protection. We see this as in a large number of countries, an expansion over the years of social assistance type social protection, as I say, either tax or donor financed, but that does not involve the employer or employee. And indeed, the idea of increasingly delinking eligibility for social protection from employment status is seen as a way forward in not just in extending coverage, but also sort of potentially tackling adequacy problems. But I'd like to come back to you on this. I mean, and indeed, some institutions are actually advocating for this, and some academics, that we just forget about establishing or strengthening the contributory angle. Let's just move to a fully tax finance or social assistance based system. But so you've mentioned issues of sort of the collective of the system, the different players involved. I'd just like to hear a comment or reflection on, is that the way forward, or just how far can we get if we go down that route?
Yes.
And what are the risks?
Okay. Well, I think it sounds attractive, doesn't it? It's like, okay, let's just uncouple this from, given that the world of work is becoming, and this is not an inevitability, by the way. There are things that we can do about it, but that the world of work at the moment seems to be becoming more informal, more precarious, delinking the issue of social protection completely from, employment status or even employment, full stop. And it can be seen as an attractive argument. And indeed, we're seeing discussions around universal basic incomes that play into that. I would say that, yes, there are benefits to the non-contributory road of social protection, but there are also quite considerable risks, and quite a lot of those have been played out in the debate over universal basic incomes. In fact, so I wouldn't dive too much into that. But the question goes to the sustainability of such questions. I mean, if you're saying that social protection systems come totally from non-contributions through employment, through work, then the question inevitably arises, well, how are you going to finance those social protection systems? It's just, you just can't really square that circle. And I like the fact that the High Commissioner did say, and as you know, she was very much involved in the design of social protection floors. The evidence is out there that these are eminently affordable. Social protection floors, of course, look at both the contributory aspect and the non-contributory aspect of social protection schemes. So we have the tools, and it's not that we don't have the tools. I think a lot of it, as I think that the point was made by the High Commissioner and others, a lot of it does come down to political choices and political will. But not to go too much into that, I hope I've answered the question from our perspective, certainly as a trade union organization, that it wouldn't solve the problem. In fact, it would create even more difficulties, both in the short and longer term, if we moved completely to non-contributory schemes. And when it comes to the issue of gender, I think, again, would only exacerbate rather than reduce, notwithstanding the fact that a majority of the world's working women are indeed in the informal economy. The route there is to formalize informal economy through provision of social protection and means of paying into social protection, rather than to say, let's move to completely non-contributory.
Anuj, can I come to you on that as well? Sure. Because the World Bank also in the WDR on jobs, has, of course, addressed this issue around the balance between contributory and non-contributory. There's been a lot of work also around a UBI, and of course the potential implications of a UBI from a gender equity or equality perspective. There are a lot of debate, including around feminists, around, on the one hand, the potential for for instance, universal basic income to free up choice, opportunities for women. At the same time, the reality, and this is coming through in a lot of the evidence on either full UBIs or quasi-UBIs, that shows that actually it tends to reinforce gendered work patterns, where particularly in couples where women are secondary earners, a UBI or UBI type approach tends to lead to women to actually withdraw from the paid workforce or reduce work effort. Yeah, could you comment on that a bit from the World Bank's perspective?
You're absolutely right. We're just going into final stages of publishing that book, to which you have contributed on the gender chapter. So you're better placed even than I to say something about it. But this was this was one of the pieces of the work that actually contribute to our thinking about the future of the social protection and what would be the ideal peak system for social protection. And if you want to talk about the ideal system is when each individual has access to social protection of the form of social protection that they need at that stage of their life. The child benefit and the whatever types of support you can get for developing the child human capital, so that you prepare them for productive work, unemployment benefits, you name it. We go through the whole life cycle, and there is never an ideal balance, because it's always going to be the combination of both the contributory and non-contributory. It's just a matter of the how do you make sure that people have access to whatever the contributory or non-contributory at the time they need it. And I think that's the very big challenge. Because right now only 50%, as we know, have any access in the globally. But if you look at the poorest population, only 55% of population have access to social protection. So from our perspective, we actually look at, okay, we need a system, but if system is at the and covering everyone, but if what you can afford is the lowest level where people are more desperate, it's also a legitimate starting point, we argue. So so I think it's a combination that we're looking. I wouldn't argue for the UBI right now, just to be clear.
Helpful to know. Elizabeth, can I just come?
And just to add that we see the UBI different from universal social protection. These are two different things. So let's not mix these things, because in some people's mind they're really mixed, and they're not.
Elizabeth, can I just come to you on this, related to this point, and some of the, again, the barriers or challenges we find in moving towards universal social protection, including strengthening, where possible, sort of contributory and employer-based social protection. What are the role of trade unions? And we see, again, in some contexts, quite contradicting trends. On the one hand, a weakening of worker representation, organization, and this being associated with a weakening of social protection in many countries. In others, and in some sectors in particular, actually very interesting movements and strengthening of these types of initiatives. How important is this? How much does it matter to promoting gender responsive social protection?
Actually, I think the pilot or the experiments we are now working either with the central government or the municipal governments will provide a lot of interesting knowledge, not just for domestic workers but for other informal workers. And we are promoting it basically focusing on raising awareness for domestic workers to not just to focus on their well-being right now and their possibility to take care of their children, the needs of the family, but also for themselves in the long run. So this is a very important awareness raising process. But at the same time, we are the one to push the government to take responsibility. I want to refer to the Mexican examples I just talked about. Actually, even though I have talked about the successes in registering 10,000 domestic workers just in the last 5 months, but at the same time we face many challenges, especially when the domestic workers are part-time domestic workers and they have multiple employers, like some work for 3 employers or 4 employers at a time. So how much each one should contribute? And actually, most of these employers who employ domestic workers for only a day, 4 hours in a week or 8 hours in a week, do not feel they are responsible for doing this. It's easier to convince the full-time employers or when the domestic workers are live-in. And it's easier to convince those employers to contribute into those schemes. But it takes so much effort. I hear from our leaders in Mexico saying that it takes up so much of our energy and time to raise awareness among the domestic workers so that they will demand their employers, but also to raise awareness of the employers that you are employers. You have to do what all the other employers are doing. But we, despite the success now looking at the numbers, but at the back of our mind, we are also worried how sustainable it is in the longer run, because the wages, even though in Mexico there is a minimum wage. I mean, not to mention in many countries there's no minimum wage for domestic workers. So even in Mexico there's a minimum wage, but the rate is really low. So we are talking about $100 in Mexico City. So the system is a contributory system by both employer and employers. We have succeeded to convince them to contribute, but it is very, very hard. And we also have this worry at the back of our mind, how sustainable it is. At certain point, when there is just a little bit addition of economic need, the domestic worker will certainly give up the contribution. Yeah. So, but anyway, we still try our best to participate in this pilot scheme because we also want to draw lessons for the government, for ourselves. What to find out the answers to your questions. What really worked for low-income, vulnerable sector workers like domestic workers.
I have time for one last question. A question to Rachel, but also to others on the panel around the role of services. So we know that social protection is effective and can impact effectively women's and girls' outcomes if linked to adequate social service, wider also basic services. And this comes across also very clearly in the study of, for instance, cash transfers, where in fact if you don't also provide good quality services, in reality you might see you might see an effect on, say, monetary poverty, but in terms of wider outcomes on girls and women, you may not see much. So services are essential, and we need to think of those as well as part of social protection, or at a minimum the links between social protection and service provision. Michelle Bachelet mentioned the access to sexual and reproductive health services, and Rachel, I just wanted to come to you on this. So public services are under threat in many countries, and at the same time are crucial. I mean, they're crucial in general to women's and girls' outcomes, but also if we want social protection to be effective, these services need to be in place and of good quality. So what do our priorities have to be, I mean, in moving forward? And given the reality in a number of countries now where administrations are actually pushing back and pushing back also specifically on services that matter to women and girls, does this have to be part of our priority, and what do we need to do or look out for?
Right, a lot there. I guess I would just start by saying I'm not quite as pessimistic as you implied in your question about social protection, if you haven't got everything else right. I mean, in general, and I work in the poorest countries, if you wait until everything is right, you will never fix anything. Right? I mean, you have to get going, and actually the evidence is that if you start doing things like cash transfers, even when you haven't fixed everything else, you make progress on an amazing range of issues. And I think my lesson from a lot of the evidence is that women are more inventive than we might give them credit for. So on sexual and reproductive health, providing young girls with information about who's most likely to have HIV, they responded even though they're in a very vulnerable situation and you might think that you have to provide all sorts of services. They figured out a way around their constraints. In work in Bangladesh, we provided cash transfers to families who had adolescent girls, all sorts of social pressure to get married early, all sorts of, whole range of complicated pressures on these communities, 25% reduction in early marriage rates. So I'm, without doing anything else. So having said, I'm slightly more optimistic about being able to do, people being able to respond. If you give them money, they will, in often places, figure out a way to cope. Now, does that mean that I don't also worry about having the schools and the health clinics? Obviously, That's really important. And I think it's really, when there is pressure on the system, you have to think about prioritizing. And I think the overall mantra is you have to prioritize around the most marginalized. Like, that is the essence of Leave No One Behind. That's the essence of, certainly, you know, if you're thinking about extreme poverty, this is where we have to prioritize. And that's one area that I think where there might be some tension across some of this discussion, in terms of where I would put my priorities. And I think it's really about thinking, I think we all have maybe different countries in our head when we have this discussion. And I think it is a question of thinking about the country and prioritizing on the country that you're focused on at any one point, right? So for me, it's about the social protection and the, you know, in the Sierra Leones of the world, the Burkina Fasos, the other places where I've worked, it's really about getting that very basic system in place. And I worry sometimes when people think, well, to relieve the pressure on that social protection, we need to, or on the health services or the education services, let's try and crowd in other financing. And so they think about, well, let's do an insurance system. So you look in Kenya, they're thinking about how do we bring in health insurance so that we get other people paying for the system to relieve pressure. But then all the thinking goes into the health insurance system, which is going to be for the people in the formal sector, who are the people who are least marginalized. Again, that's not, you know, I know the answer is maybe bring people into the formal sector, but in Burkina Faso, you are so far from that. You've got to be designing a system where you know that the vast majority of people are going to be in the informal sector for as long as we can think in terms of our horizon. So we need a system that works for them. So it's not just about, so for me, it's about getting those basic services, primary education, basic sexual and human and reproductive health rights, with some basic social protection in terms of cash transfers, is got to be the first priority in the poorest countries in the world.
Thank you. Okay, all right. So I think we'll open up to the floor now. There should be a microphone circulating. Is there a mic? Can you just pass it to? Can I ask you to briefly state your name and what organization you're from, and then we'll take, and whether you're addressing your question to anyone specifically. If not, we can then, we'll take 2 or 3 questions and then come back.
Myself, Mittal. I am coming from India, Self-Employed Women's Association Seva, and also working with the Vigo. So I'm representing here as a partner of the Vigo. I think, thank you for your insights. Cross-cutting area, because in India, 93% of workforce is informal sector. So how we can address the cross-cutting area, like a recognition and registration of the informal workers, which is quite important. If you are not recognized, then how you will demand for the social protection. So sector specific is required to make up some gap, like domestic worker, because we are part of the alliance of that. But I think worker lens is quite important when we are designing and implementing the things. And financing is the issue, but better to focus on the leakages, better to focus on the implementation, monitoring, that can help us. And many times, criteria set for the inclusion, targeted, mainly women are excluded. So like to get the benefit, maternity benefit, we have the criteria that breastfeeding is the essential. How women has to prove that breastfeeding? Or new insurance scheme, we are happy that for the tertiary care, we have the insurance scheme. But in that scheme, prolapse uterus is not included. And just one question to all speakers, because we found that because of the new technology and skill upgradation not done, so women are excluded. Women participation is decreasing because of the technology. So in your experience, or what is how we are doing the skill upgradation, but this is the important area because globalization technology is increasing and it's not easy to access for the women because for them, their family is their priority. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hello, is this on? Hi, my name is Amber Parks. I'm with Oxfam. Thanks for a really interesting panel discussion. I wanted to pick up on the point about informal sector workers with unpaid care responsibilities, because we know that this later goes on to become a major source of inequality for women in later life as well, when we're thinking about pensions and that sort of thing, but thinking specifically about the informal sector. And I just wondered if the panel could share any examples of successful parental leave schemes that you've come across and the extent to which you've seen them targeting both men and women so that we're encouraging both mothers and fathers to be taking up care responsibilities, because this is arguably one of the main factors for change as well. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I'm Kate Horsted from Age International. I was really pleased to hear Rachel and also others mentioning older women, because you're right, they often are invisible in policy and in data. And it is they do face particular discrimination and particular vulnerabilities, and that is really important to recognise. But I also think it's really important to capture the kind of the complexity of older women's lives. And like all women, they are sometimes vulnerable, but also they are active contributors in many ways. And we actually carried out some research with ODI into older women's economic roles and found that they do continue to do significant amounts of unpaid care work, and often they are doing paid work as well, and in quite informal and precarious settings, but they don't fit very neatly often into the categories that we talk about here, like domestic workers. Sometimes it is domestic work, but often it is harder to categorise. So I think something we really need to address is how we ensure that older women are protected, both at the point when they are in need of care, but also when they're carers themselves and working, so that there's sort of more of a universality about it. So it'd be great to hear if you had any thoughts on that. Thank you.
I think we'll take, we can take two more, I think, then we'll come back.
Hi, my name is Laura Alford from Women in Informal Employment, Globalizing and Organizing, WeGo. It was really a question for Elizabeth and about spaces for participation in the making of social protection policies and programs. One of the issues we come up against is that quite often we feel that there aren't actually spaces for those voices to come through. And I just wanted to know whether that's your experience as well as throughout your own network of IDWF, and what potential you see to change that as well. Thanks.
I think one more, and then we'll have another round after.
Thank you very much. My name is Fatmata Sisse, and I work with UN Women. I just have many things on my lap, so if you don't mind that I don't stand up. Yes, I'm very glad to hear about the discussion on informal workers, because I think it doesn't come out clearly very easily. But when we look at the whole aspect of social protection, especially in Africa, and I'm thinking in many other developing countries, women in the informal sector has to show up. And often it's the area we don't discuss. It's the least area that probably we know what's best, what needs to be done. So discussing that in this forum and possibly coming up with ideas on what needs to be done, I think is really critical for the discussion on social protection. I'm also happy that you highlighted the issue of the Middle East. as you presented, actually, that kept occurring to me, that what is going on. And it's very good to see that you're presenting it from an optimistic point of view for the countries that are actually passing out some laws or allowing some association of domestic workers, because I'm sure many of us have seen quite a number of examples of WhatsApp videos. Of course, you have a lot of doubts on them about what women in developing countries that go to those countries actually face. And often it really bothers me not knowing what to do, but then bringing that discussion here and knowing that those countries are actually taking up some action is really a bit of something that is pleasing. My final point is on the elderly widows. Again, very good to highlight this group, and it brings me to the point that in such discussions, it's probably important for us to compartmentalize the women we are talking about, because we need specific interventions for a particular group of women. And just when you compartmentalize them, it helps us to then identify what needs to be done, so we don't have blanket interventions for all women. But it then reminds me, what are we doing about widowers as well? What about the old, the aged men? Possibly they have already been into contributory schemes and there's not much to be done, but it should be highlighted so that constantly we are not only focusing on the women, but we are providing evidence as to why we should be focusing only on women. Otherwise, we're losing the debate of gender aspects of social protection. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think let's have a round of responses. Chidi, will you go first, and you don't feel that you need to answer everything, but those that you have something pressing to say.
Yeah, indeed. I think probably I'll start by saying, because there's so much to say on this topic, that I will maybe just start by highlighting a briefing that the ITC has produced, which is available on our website, and we can certainly circulate the link, which is on this very issue, which covers many of the questions, I think, that have come up, including the last question about what do we do about widows and social protection and the issue of survivors' pensions, etc., which is, again, another huge area of discrimination and of, in fact, poverty or gender-based, if you like, poverty that arises because of the lack of or the failure of social protection systems to take this issue into account, that we can talk about so many issues such as, care credits to provide for the interruption of work by women. And this applies to women in the informal. We tend to think about it only as women working in formal jobs. What do you do when you leave your work to go and raise kids? But it's especially important, of course, as well for women in the informal economy who livelihoods depend on them being able to be at their workplace, at their market stall, at the home where they deliver domestic care. What happens when they then have to take time off to look after their children, or indeed look after elderly or other dependent relatives? We see too often in marketplaces around the world, women with babies in cardboard boxes under their market stalls, coming back to work maybe a week, 2 weeks after giving birth. This is, I think, in anybody's vision of the world, not acceptable, but this is the reality of many women working in the informal economy because of a failure of systems to take them into place. And I will maybe end my responses to this by coming back on two issues. The issue about parental leave for women working in the informal economy. I have to say that I'm not aware of any scaled up systems that do this. I know that there are some attempts. Elizabeth could talk, for example, about the way I was just going to talk about the domestic workers in the Dominican Republic and what the trade unions and domestic workers are doing together to try to enable this. But again, this is a very localized, small system. I could look at Uruguay, where there is a more comprehensive state system, and that's probably the best model that we have at the moment. Which then takes me back to the question of, well, do we look at scale or do we look at the smaller, more targeted interventions that can perhaps produce more immediate results, as you talked about? And I should say I'm from Sierra Leone, so I know the situation in my country very, very well. And of course, there's a case for the smaller, more targeted interventions, but there are also huge risks associated to that. And I think you kind of identified that, is that we lose sight of the bigger picture. there is no reason why a country like Sierra Leone cannot provide services related to public health care, related to public social care. As I say, it comes down to political choices that we make, which are not always down. I won't go further than that, but not always down to the individual country. But of course, they operate in a global economy, and sometimes there are pressures about where they put their tax dollars, if I can put it that way. These countries produce workforces that they're incapable of absorbing, but they're providing the workforce for perhaps more industrialized countries when it comes to healthcare and social protection, social services. We need to look at that. That in itself is unsustainable. So I think the danger that I would alert to in looking at those more targeted, smaller interventions is not losing sight of that bigger picture and what needs to be done in relation to that, and what is actually doable, feasible in relation to that.
Thank you. Rachel?
So I was just going to talk about this issue of how we're talking about a very wide range of country concerns here. Mexico, the US, UK, Sierra Leone, and a sort of obvious response in most of development is to say, well, it all depends on the country, which I think is, absolutely right. You've got to look at what the resources are, what the needs are, who's most vulnerable, building a system that will hopefully endure over the long term. And I agree, there's a concern about building something that's just about short-term need. But that can sometimes leave us in development of saying, not saying anything and just saying it's all, it's all got to be country specific. So I just want to throw out something which is hopefully useful for the afternoon session, which is something we've been working at to think about country typologies. In other words, sort of what are a set of different kinds of, countries that have this kind of situation or, this kind of resources, this kind of problem, so that we can start saying something that's general but also tailored to the needs of an individual country. And for me, in this area, when we talk about informal, formal versus informal is a huge dividing line. What percentage of your population are formal or versus informal is a huge dividing line in how you think about designing the right system. But within informal, I think there's huge differences there, right? Because some people are in informal in that they're really in an employment situation, but they're just not registered. Like many domestic workers. They are employed and they clearly have an employer, and the employer just pretends that they're not an employer, right? And then there are people who are doing a little bit of work on the side in their home who don't have an employer other than, the family. That's a much more informal system. And I think you have to think about how you design social protection in that context very, very differently. The women who are working in agriculture, the women I work with in Bangladesh who are doing, taking in a bit of tailoring or, selling a little bit on the side, but they're not, you can't formalize them anytime soon. So I would sort of suggest where that is the dominant situation, or, a Mexico case where there's a lot of people in the informal sector, but it's a bit more of a formal informal sector and then an actual formal sector, and sort of challenge us to think about those three different categories and systems that work for countries that have different ratios of those three groups of women particularly.
Sure. I think many of the issues, questions have been covered, and I wanted just to echo to what Rachel just said. The informal sector is not homogeneous; it's very diverse, and it's and diverse by different nature of work, but also in different countries. You would be surprised how different forms and shapes of the informal work one can see. And I don't think we have good evidence of what has worked well. So I think that is one area that is we need to study still. We try to take a little bit of stock of what is going on in the world, and tomorrow there will be a formal launch of the white paper about the social protection in the and future of work. And I think that there is an increasing risk of, and there will be some suggestions on how to deal with these issues. So stay tuned for that. But we also we agree that we need to bring these examples together to study from each other. So we will be our next. For example, South Learning Forum will be that we convene every 2-3 years will be about that. But there are some emerging good cases, I would say, in all regions, from and for all categories of informal sector. In Ghana, for example, we have seen the informal sector pension scheme. While in South Africa, we see an informal sector skills development, skill for younger population. So it's not only one part of the demographic spectrum. Also, we have to look at the continuum. And so I think what we find, though, makes a lot of difference is I thought the good example is India, where they have massively registered, given people the IDs with Aadhaar, and then now are massively registering for the bank accounts, and there is also a central provident fund provide pension scheme for informal sector. That's the most massive effort we have seen, and we're gonna try to study too, so we can share these experiences with each other. But I think my point is that we're still in a learning mode on this, and how to actually include informal sector workers in social protection, and not only include but also provide the tailored service that is actually for that particular group of the informal workers.
Thank you, Anush. So, Elizabeth, I come to you. There was a question specifically to you, Laura Alfers asked around spaces for participation. So I'll ask you to come to that, but also a question that comes from the online system that I'll turn to you about references. It says there are several references to political will. What does this mean in practice? And for example, in the case of including domestic workers in Mexico, what are the political factors that enable or constrain the expansion of social protection?
I need another session.
Yeah, if you can briefly address these two questions, and then we'll come
they
to
are very interesting. On participation, our experience is we have to be able to show that we represent. So we have domestic workers with us, and we really represent them, and we are their voice. So the main work and objective of my organization is still organizing, to bring domestic workers who are scattered in all the individual homes to come together and to be able to have a voice, so that they know what are at stake, and they can talk to the government. But equally important is also to have partners, to build alliances, especially for domestic workers, because employers are everywhere. It's very important that we have good alliances with trade unions, who also advocate and fight for workers' rights. We also need to build alliances with a whole range of community groups, because in any one of them, I can say, they are employers. So it's important to have their support, to have their understanding, and so that we can all speak one voice to the government. And that also partly answer to the second question, what make the political will of government. In Mexico, this pilot scheme did not come, suddenly from the sky. We have been working with the domestic workers for since the early 90s. So it's about 20 years. In the 2000s, the government first agreed to extend, but voluntarily. And that has been there for 20 years. And it's only now that the government agreed to take more serious steps. The push, from the domestic workers themselves and their alliance is the key, I must say. But of course, the current government, which is more sympathetic to informal workers' voice, is also a very key issue. And finally, I also want to add that about the need to have strong and good partners is also in Mexico. You have heard of the film Roma. Yes. So in the film, the social media, the industry, there's also a growing support of domestic workers' rights, and the award and the wide popular support of the film also play a role to push the government, really to do something. So all these have worked together, and I just want to stress, we need to have ourselves, as a very strong organization, but then we also need to have good partners.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So unfortunately, our time is up. I think we could have gone on discussing much longer, but I will ask our panelists to just give us a final one or maximum two key action points that you think are the priority thing we need to do moving forward. And Anoush, I'll start, if you could start, and we'll just work our way back to me, a final plea or suggestion.
Yes. Two final words. I think it's very important that the social protection services are accessible to women, and we looked at barriers to accessing these services, and use the latest technological advancements to actually make these services accessible to give them IDs, give them bank accounts, give them money, so that that they feel included. Otherwise, we're not gonna, unless we do massive results in these areas, key basic areas. We're not gonna have the social protection for all, and there will always be somebody left behind.
Thank you, Rachel.
So I sort of did my practical picture in my last thing about, think about designing things for these different kinds of, countries, and also, keep that lens on the most marginalized, who don't have a voice in design.
I think I would look at big picture things. So 2 or 3 things for us. First is decent work and the importance of decent work to universal social protection and the sustainability of those systems. And when I say decent work, I'm looking at the ILO's definition of decent work. And that's how we measure informality, actually, in the trade union movement. It's by access to those rights under the decent work pillars, which include productive employment, freely chosen. It includes having a voice and say at your workplace, whether you're an informal economy workplace or more formal economy workplace. It includes being able to participate in social dialogue with governments and employers, and it includes social protection. tax justice, I would say, would be another key element to this, and we need to look at that again. I mean, I don't really like overusing the term gender lens, but we do need to put a gender lens on how we design tax policies of taxation, and that goes to wider macroeconomic policy as well. So I could say more on that if we had more time, but I'll just throw those into the mix. I just want to say this is the time to invest in domestic workers. I started to organize domestic workers in 1989. In the first 12 years, nobody asked me a question about what I was doing. Nobody was interested in domestic workers. But now it's totally changed. Now there's a lot of interest, a lot of questions, lots of research on this sector. And most importantly, domestic workers are mobilizing themselves. They are not like before, hidden, invisible. They are mobilizing themselves. They have come up. They like to join organizations. They want to meet government. They want to meet all of you. This is the time, really that things can be done and happen, and even in Middle East. And so I'm also optimistic, but based on evidence. I hope you share this.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much to our 4 speakers. Thank you all in the room. Thank you to those that are following us online. This is, yes, an ongoing conversation. We will be coming out with the roadmap we mentioned and other documents, more studies, but also ideally and concrete action points to take this agenda forward. So stay tuned, and thanks so much for participating today. Thank you.
Thank you.